Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to ACSM's Professional Development Webinar Series presented by Forrest T. Jones and Company. This is Lynette Kraft. I'm the ACSM Chief Science Officer. Welcome. Today's webinar is titled Get the Word Out, Writing Op-Eds to Optimize Publishing Success and Impact. Before we get started, I want to go over a few housekeeping things. First, if you have a question during the webinar, please just type it into the question area on your screen, and we'll try to get to as many of these as we can at the end of the presentation. Also, I'd like to thank today's sponsor, Forrest T. Jones and Company. If you are an ACSM member, you qualify for exclusive member discounts through Forrest T. Jones. Be sure to check out the ACSM website member benefits page for more information on that. Finally, if you'd like to join the conversation about today's webinar on Twitter, we encourage you to do so by using the hashtag ACSMWebinar. I'd like to now introduce today's presenters, Dr. Liz Joy and Dr. David Conroy. Dr. Joy currently serves as a medical director for community health, health promotion and wellness, and food and nutrition at Intermountain Healthcare in Utah, and is the immediate past president of ACSM. Dr. Conroy is a professor in the Department of Kinesiology and Human Development and Family Studies at Penn State University. So welcome to both David and Liz. And with that, we'll turn it over to Dr. Conroy and get started.
Well, thanks for that kind introduction, Lynette, and thank you all for joining us today. I know Liz and I have both been really excited, looking forward to this webinar. What we're going to try to cover in the next short period of time is a number of things that are important for getting op-eds out and stimulating public discourse. In this day and age where we hear a lot about fake news, we think it's really important that professionals who know something about health sciences and physical activity get that message out to the public. So here are a few things that we're going to cover today to help you getting your perspective and your expertise out, stimulating public discourse. First, we'll address the idea that these op-ed pieces are part of an editorial discourse that editors are trying to cultivate with readers. And the role that you can play as a writer in that is very important for editors. So you need to cultivate that relationship on behalf of the editor. We'll talk about how to find your voice. You don't have to be the world's leading expert in a topic to write an op-ed. You can write something very passionate from personal experience, professional experience, and leverage your professional expertise in the process. We'll talk about how to identify a hook to make your piece interesting. These are not journal articles. They're very short pieces. Op-eds tend to run around 750 words oftentimes, and you don't need to bore your reader to death, as often happens with scientific papers. You need to instead be quick, you need to be punchy, you need to have a good hook to capture their attention up front. We'll talk about how to do that. Another issue that's important is timing these submissions. Op-eds speak to moments, and we'll get into what the moments are that call for different kinds of op-eds. And we'll also talk about how to structure them. At the end, we'll also wrap up with a little warning, a caveat about what to expect when you have an op-ed out there that can capture attention and stimulate reader interest. So with that introduction in mind, I'll turn it over to Liz to start us out talking about the dialogue with editors.
All right, thanks so much, David. I've had an opportunity to write a number of different op-eds on a pretty wide variety of topics. And as it relates to, kind of working with editors and being part of that kind of public dialogue, I have really cultivated a relationship with the editor for the editorial page for the Salt Lake Tribune. I did so through a community leader who said, that, Dr. Joy, Intermountain Healthcare, is kind of a source of truth, that we wouldn't be fake news, and that what we could provide to the public, through an op-ed would be meaningful, and it would be actionable, and it would kind of contribute to that kind of public discussion. In Utah, for example, we have an air quality problem. Probably many of you know that we struggle in the wintertime with inversions as a result of our geography. And in the summer, because we're essentially a desert, we struggle with ground level ozone. And so knowing that that's, an important public health issue here in Utah, and that we need to provide, high quality information, to the public, I actually ended up kind of with a deal with one of the local newspapers that I could write something once a month on air quality and or environmental health. And, it wouldn't be a blanket acceptance, but that they would, certainly try and make it possible that these articles could be published. And so, what you see here on the screen is one op-ed that we submitted in the springtime that was looking at building energy efficiency and how that impacts air quality. And then you see another one a little bit later in the summer that was around summer air quality, and particularly as it relates to ozone. And what I included below is, again, as David was saying, you need to be, kind of timely. And if I were talking about, I wouldn't talk about ozone, for example, in the wintertime, because ozone pollution is primarily a problem in the summer. Or likewise, I wouldn't talk about, inversions in the summer. But they were, talking already about, ozone pollution. And so the op-ed was really timely in terms of tying into some of the other news sources, that were in discussion at that same time. Maybe the next slide. So here is an example of this idea of kind of establishing your credibility, as a source of truth, so that not only will editors, want to publish the piece that you wrote, but that the public, who is reading this, whether it's, just, community members or people who are decision makers, government leaders, for example. This was an op-ed that I led the writing on several years ago that was around getting smoking rooms out of the Salt Lake City airport. As probably many of you recall, when Dr. Vivek Murthy was the Surgeon General, there's a famous tweet of him giving the thumbs down to the Atlanta airport that still had smoking rooms, in the airport. And Salt Lake is building a new international airport, and they were planning to put smoking rooms in there. And so what I did is I identified a number of thought leaders in the healthcare community who would join me in writing this op-ed. And we were very intentional in terms of calling out what their roles were. I got Brent Wallace, who was the Vice President and Chief Medical Officer of Intermountain, to join on this. Likewise, Dr. Steve Barlow, who was our Chief Medical Officer for an insurance company, and Sarah Woolsey, who is the Medical Director of our Medicare Quality Improvement Organization. And so, and also is on the Utah Tobacco Free Advisory Committee. But the point is that, this actually ended up really influencing some decisions that were made. It was happening also during the time where there was kind of a political debate between mayoral candidates, one of whom was very opposed to having smoking rooms in the airport, and the other one who thought having 2 smoking rooms was just no big deal. And so again, back to David's comment that, timing is really important for this to be part of that public dialogue. But in order for us to kind of influence the influencers or the decision makers, it was important to have, I think a group of thought leaders who were highly respected in the community to be a part of this particular piece.
Hey, Liz, Lynette, I'm going to interrupt just a second. We're getting several comments that the microphone is really picking up your treadmill. And while I appreciate your enthusiasm for walking, it's, I guess, a little distracting because those listening remotely are hearing a lot of treadmill noise. So.
All right. Well, I'll turn it off, and I'll just stand here.
All right. Sorry. Thanks.
I think
Okay.
the point that you made, Liz, about forming a coalition to have multiple voices singing off the same song sheet's really important. It adds authority. Sole author pieces are wonderful. They're oftentimes very effective, but what you did there really seemed to be high impact.
Yeah. All right, let's go to the next slide. Okay, so, David had also mentioned how it's important to kind of have a hook. At least in our local newspaper, op-eds can't be more than about 500 words. And so, it's really about kind of making it interesting, right from the get-go so that people will continue to read. I mean, there's always about half a dozen or more op-eds in our Sunday newspaper. And, I have to think in that first paragraph, what is it that's going to make them to continue reading, this particular op-ed? And so this idea about don't bury your lead, really open with your conclusion. So this is a couple of paragraphs taken from the piece we wrote on trying to get smoking rooms out of the airport, and we did kind of say, there's just there's no reason why we should be promoting the use of tobacco smoking in any way, shape, or form, since it is the leading cause of preventable deaths due to cancer and heart disease, killing nearly 500,000 people each year. So boom, there you go. I mean, this is why, this was the compelling why we should not have smoking rooms in our airport. And then it led right into the current kind of political challenge that was brewing at the time with our mayoral candidates. So, like I said, I know that this op-ed had a pretty big impact. That's why I use this one as an example. And in fact, it ended up being a key component as to why our sitting mayor at the time, Ralph Becker, ended up losing the election. And his opponent, Jackie Biskupski, who was very opposed to smoking rooms in the airport, she ended up winning. And this was one of the very first things she did, was to kill smoking rooms in the Salt Lake City airport. So it was a very effective op-ed.
I think one of the things to note here is that this style is very different from typical academic writing, where we build an argument and then hammer home a conclusion at the end. We don't have that luxury in an op-ed. You've got to get, cut to the chase right away, let readers know what your perspective is, and then you can hit a few reasons to support that perspective. But you need to lay that out up front in contrast to typical writing.
I guess, another way to put it too is, it's a little bit of edutainment, right? I mean, you've got to be, compelling. It can't be dry. This isn't, this isn't preventing chronic disease or JAMA. It's really about, making it so that people want to read it. So I want to go back to this idea about timing your submission, and whether it's something in the news like the pieces we did around summer air quality, or whether or not it's aligning with kind of other events, around the year. So this is an op-ed that we wrote just a couple of months ago on diabetes prevention, and I had actually reached out to the editor of the newspaper back in October to say, hey, listen, November is Diabetes Month by the American Diabetes Association, and I gave just a little teaser to him in an email to saying, we want to, we're going to send you an op-ed around diabetes prevention. These are the reasons why. So I gave him the compelling why, and I want you to publish it in November. And so then I wrote this with a colleague who is, you know, a public health professional in the diabetes prevention space. So again, going back to that kind of credibility piece. And you know, they published this in November. And actually it was picked up by our healthcare CEO, Dr. Mark Harrison, who then tweeted it out and sent it out through LinkedIn. And it probably went to literally millions of people. I think he's one of the most followed people in LinkedIn, and he sent this out as well. So that's another part of this, is that, and I know David's going to talk more about this at the end, is that these op-eds, while they may go into your local paper or maybe into a national paper, but then it's how do you repurpose them, you know, and link out to them to get even a greater impact.
Yeah, I think in the physical activity world, we have so many opportunities to tie our science into current events. We've got pro sports year round, so there's a cycle of championships. We have March Madness coming up. What a great time if you're doing anything related to basketball, whether it's injury prevention or stress, anything about high performance. We just finished the Olympics. If you're doing things in youth sport, you could tie into the Little League World Series. Then every disease has its own month. So there is not a time of year where we shouldn't have op-eds about the importance of physical activity for living healthy and happy lives out there. The question is, can you find the right time for the piece you want to write?
So let's go to the next slide. Okay, so this is kind of around structuring your essay. And it kind of goes back to my point on edutainment, you know, that it's, you know, you want to give them the facts, but you also, I think you want to be a little provocative, you know, and you want to kind of tie, you know, the facts into something that is, again, going to be really meaningful and potentially actionable for the readers. Now, this is an op-ed that I wrote, but I did not actually send in to the newspaper because I ultimately decided that it was just a little too provocative, and that you know, my role as the medical director of community health at Intermountain, that it would just attract too much negative attention. And David's going to talk more about that, but you know, and you do want to stimulate a dialogue, and sometimes it's good to be provocative and kind of poke at the bear. But you know, you have to think about what's the potential fallout of that. So you know, again, from just going back to the structural point, so you know, in yellow, you know, it's no surprise, I don't think, to anyone this year that we're in the midst of one of the worst flu epidemics of the 21st century. I mean, you know, unless you live in a closet, you know, everybody knows that. But probably what people didn't know was that nationwide 4,000 people per week were dying from influenza, and that the current death rate was as high or higher than observed in flu epidemics back in you know, earlier in the century. So that was kind of the old news and kind of the new piece that I thought was important for people to know. And also, that, you know, kind of using my green theme here, that the current virus H3N2 wreaked havoc in Australia before landing on our shores, resulting in a record number of cases and deaths. Again, new news, you know, probably to the US reader, that, you know, what we were experiencing in the US actually had been experienced in Australia 6 months sooner. And then again, old news, certainly usual recommendation to get your flu shot. But the new news, at least from my perspective, was that the CDC didn't actually release its first health action news, or health action alert, or whatever they call that, you know, until we were well into the epidemic. It came out in late December. So that was kind of the new news, and it goes on from there. But again, it's just this idea of not just saying the facts, because they can get that from CNN or on their phone or whatever else, but it's also kind of tying in other pieces of information, that they may not know about.
There's oftentimes a rule of three that gets talked about for these op-ed pieces, where once you state your thesis and make your main point, it's helpful to come up with 3 examples or 3 sources of evidence or 3 points you want to make to bolster it, and then wrap up at the end with a counterpoint. Think about, well, what's the argument that I should anticipate the reader having in their head? Because if you can anticipate their argument and head it off, you've done a much better job, or you'll do a much better job of persuading them about your point. So think about that as you're going through. I think Liz has given a great example of tying into current events and doing a little bit of back and forth to create some tension and weave it in. But try not to overwhelm readers with too many pieces of information to support your position. Think about the 3 big ones, and then try to think about what argument they're having with you in their head so you can head that off.
And another point along those same lines is that the editors, will fact check. So I said 4,000 people per week are dying from influenza. If I had sent that in, they would have had one of their editors fact check to make sure that that is right. Or there's a few other points I made a little bit further on, and I put very specific dates in there. They will fact check that. And if they look at something and they go, oh my gosh, so much fact checking to do, we're not interested, too much work. So you can also, anticipate where it's important to have to make sure that you've got your facts right. Make it easy for the editors, so that they don't look at it and say, this is too much work. We're not going to consider it.
Absolutely. So let's say you get your piece out there. What happens next? Well, here's a tale that I like sharing with people. We had a piece, Kate Wolin and Mercy Carnathon and I put out a piece related to a paper we'd written looking at changes in BMI in baseball players over the years. And we'd written a really cute title for the essay. It was 3 Strikes Against Healthy Role Models. And we were pointing out that obesity has started to show up technically in baseball players. Well, it turns out the authors don't get to write their headlines. Editors own that headline. In fact, there's specialty editors who do that. And their job is to get readers to click on this, to read the whole article. So our 3 strikes must have been too milquetoast for them. They didn't think anybody wanted to read that. So they said, baseball players are getting fat like us. Well, we did not use the F word in our paper, but the F word is something that catches people's attention. It arouses emotions. And I will tell you that the amount of people that found my email address, that found our Twitter handles, that found us on social media, and sent us all sorts of messages, I would say 9-to-1 against the idea that baseball players are fat, which we never said, but they only read the headline. They didn't read the rest of it. This was a surprise to me, how much of a reaction an op-ed piece can get on a topic that I thought was pretty innocuous. So if you do get a piece out there, don't be surprised if the trolls come out. It's not the cute trolls from the movie. It's the trolls who are living at home, maybe with their moms, without a job, and writing angry things to you. This is part of our responsibility, is to create that dialogue. So even though it might not feel pleasant having it directed at you, the fact that you're getting people talking about science and public health and physical activity is a good sign. So where can you find out more about how to write op-eds? I think there are a lot of really great resources out there that we can all tap into. One particularly notable one is the OpEd project, which is a website that lays out how to make pitches to editors, how to structure essays, provides examples. They do workshops around the country as well, but this is a phenomenal resource for promoting science in the public dialogue. The American Psychological Association has a newsletter called The Monitor, and just earlier this month, they had a couple of pages on how to write op-eds as well. So if you Google that, you can look to their advice. And there's a website called The Conversation, which has come up. Now, this is a organization that many universities have aligned with, and their designed to be an outlet for placing op-eds. And they don't retain ownership over the content. Instead, they make that available to other papers that want to pull their content to reprint. So you could publish something on The Conversation and the Washington Post might pick it up, or CNN might pick it up, USA Today could pick it up. Or it might be it's just the readers of The Conversation. But there's a number of pieces on there already, really interesting ones about physical activity, and you could add more to that bank if you want. It's a great place to put your ideas if you don't have a specific editor in mind who you want to give them to. In fact, it's a really attractive place in some ways, because very often if you approach an editor, they want exclusive rights to your piece, which means that you can pitch it to them and you can't pitch it to others. Just like when you submit a journal article, you submit it to one place and have to wait for them to decline or accept it before you can do anything else with it. If you put it at The Conversation, multiple places, multiple outlets could pick it up. And if you have a timely piece that's well written, they're likely to. The last resource I'd point you to, if you're at a university, is your external relations office. Chances are that your university has professionals in media who are working to get good news from the university out. They can use to share with alumni, share with legislators, share with funding agencies. So they know editors, they know writers, they know reporters. They can help you to find the right place for your ideas if you want to put them into the public dialogue.
I'll add too, just maybe not so much from the resources perspective, but going back to this final bullet on external relations office, is that your work can also be a message from your institution. If your institution is trying to actually kind of get behind a particular issue. So, when I've had something that I thought, would be a position of not only me as the writer, but of the healthcare organization or of your institution, I've taken it, to people in our PR and public relations, public information office, and just made sure that my message is aligned with their message. And let them help me with some editing. Because the last thing you want to do is write a really good op-ed only to realize that, it's a little bit off from the position of your senior vice president or of your dean or, something like that. You really do want it to be, a positive experience for you within your own organization, as well as, providing, good, meaningful, actionable information to the community.
Yeah. And I think that wraps up and what we were planning to say, and it's a good note to end on, to not step in it. So if anybody has any questions, I think we have a little time. We'd be happy to answer what we can.
Okay, everyone, this is Lynette again. If you have a question, feel free to type it into the question box. Also, we want to let you know that if you're ACSM member and you have an op-ed published, please share it with us so that we can help promote it as well. You can send it to publicinfo@acsm.org, or you can tweet it to us at acsm.news. We have a couple questions to get us started. This is from Sarah. She says, I work at a university and I know that I need to publish in journals. How can I convince my department these are also important contributions?
Well, if you're at a public university, it is so important for your university to be visible at the state level when it comes appropriations time. So, you've got many layers of review in the promotion and tenure process, and I wouldn't expect that every level will appreciate an op-ed piece in the same way. But for the amount of time it takes, it can be well worth it in terms of raising visibility. If nothing else, it might get you onto the radar of other people on campus. So I think it's a fantastic idea to get these out there. Whether they pay off for promotion and tenure or not, I think you should still write the grants and journal articles and teach well and participate in service, all those things. But this is a fantastic addition, kind of the icing on the cake, if you will, from my perspective.
Great, thanks, David. One of our viewers did note that the OpEd project link is not written there correctly. It's opedproject.org instead of .com. Just to correct that for everybody who might want to go and take a look. Okay, here's another question. This one's from Jonathan. He says, the essays seem pretty short. How long do you typically spend writing them?
Wow, they are short. I've written some, I bet, in 20 minutes. Because, I'll use the prediabetes one as an example. I mean, I spend about a third of my time, working in diabetes prevention. So I know that information like the back of my hand, and I knew exactly what I wanted to say to the community. So that one was pretty quick. It was about, 560 words, something like that. So just over kind of what the newspaper requests. But, the one that we wrote on building energy efficiency and how that impacted air quality, I bet that took 6 weeks of going back and forth with Utah Clean Energy and with the sustainability office at Intermountain Healthcare, and with one of our director of sustainability, and ultimately communications and public relations for Intermountain, because we were speaking for the organization. So in that case, it took a really long time. I bet it was at least a month or 6 weeks, to try and get it right before we sent that in. And again, it was only, 500 to 600 words. So I think it really depends on the topic.
I like the idea of quick first drafts, write it over a cup of coffee, but then come back to it a little while later and edit it. You only have 500 or 600 words, maybe 750 in some cases, which means you really need to be careful how you use them. And you're going to have to pull out the fluff, the passive voice, and try to make those sentences as short, punchy, easy to understand as possible, because the readers are not going to work too hard to track your train of thought. If you're not really clear, they're not going to stick with you. So I think the initial draft, it's easy to be quick, and then editing after that can be open-ended.
Okay, thanks. I think we have time for one more question. This is from Brady. Brady says, as a student who might want to think about writing an op-ed, would it be better to write about your own work in your own lab, or to try and identify a timely topic to take on?
That's a great question, and I'm not sure you can go wrong either way. The important thing is that you have something to say. Find a topic that you have an opinion about, and you can base it off of the science you're doing, provided you can stay away from the jargon and technical details, or you can base it on something that's going on in the community that you have some expertise about. But I think the most important thing is that you feel somewhat passionately about what you're writing about. That's what makes a good op-ed, I think.
Agree.
Okay, I lied. We're going to do one more. This is a good one. So what about some advice on how to translate, complex or basic science findings into a voice that resonates with the lay public?
Well, one thing you can do, and David, he'd like to hear what you have to say too, but ask somebody who's not, a scientist to read what you've written, and to see whether or not it really resonates with them, if they understand it. And I'll reference the one I wrote on public health leadership. I actually sent that out to a number of different people to say, what do you think about this? And I've done that with regularity, to my non-sciencey, non-healthcare friends, and say, what do you think about this? And did you understand it? And did it make sense? And will it change your thinking or what you do? So that's one way to ensure that you're speaking to the right audience.
And I think that's a great suggestion. The other thing I would encourage you to do if you're coming from an academic background is don't think of this as academic writing. It's edutainment, as Liz said, and you need to give yourself permission to make some generalizations and say some bold things without putting all the caveats on at the end. You can't do that in a journal article, I know that, but you can do that here, and you have to do that here to be effective, because the average reader doesn't care about all the nuance and caveats and limitations. They want you to get to the point, and I think that's a really important difference between the two styles of writing. Some people find that very refreshing and energizing to be able to do that. Other people almost feel guilt-ridden when they're writing like that, but you've got to distill this to a level that people who aren't experts, aren't specialists, can enjoy reading and can take something away from.
And and so another strategy too is to identify some columnists who are writing op-eds regularly, and kind of see what their style is, and you'll just learn how to, the same way, if we want to write for JAMA, we read lots of JAMA articles and figure out what is the style that those editors want. And so I read, some regular columnists, and I'm sure I've picked up on their writing styles as well, so that I'm more effective in writing op-eds.
Yeah. Great. All right. Thanks again to Dr. Joy and Dr. Conroy. On behalf of ACSM and our sponsor, Forrest T. Jones and Company, we thank all of you for attending today's webinar. And with that, we'll conclude the webinar.
Thank you all.
Thanks so much, everybody.